Good question. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. My name is Peter Brusso from the American University, from upstate New York as well. Earlier you referenced that as chairman of the House Administration Committee, your policy on not allowing exceptions created some strife with some of the more senior members. As chairman of the Ways and Means, how has your attempt to control pork barreling or other special items in spending bills affected your relationship with your colleagues in the House?
Based upon the whole earmark controversy right now, that would be a pretty good question, except that Ways and Means addressed it a long time ago. We're charged with the responsibility of the tax code. That's a pretty sobering responsibility once you think about it. Because if politics is the process of who gets what, when, and how, every other committee deals with it in a secondary way. The Ag Committee passes policy in which money gets voted for something to happen. Ways and Means changes a line in the tax code and you win or you lose. I mean, it's just fundamental raw politics. You need to be sober in what you're doing. If someone suggests a change in the code, your first question should be, what's the consequence? Who are the winners? Who are the losers? What does it do to the income? Is revenue decreased? Is revenue increased? To what extent does it conflict with another section? So a long time ago, we created, along with the Finance Committee that has the same responsibility in the Senate, the Joint Committee on Taxation. It's a bipartisan, professional group who analyze the legislation. The House of Representatives is slightly different than the Senate. The Ways and Means Committee is different than the House. Every amendment that's offered in Ways and Means has to be in written form. It has to have been analyzed by the Joint Committee on Taxation. We know, the best we're able with the brightest minds that we can get, the consequences of the amendment. So you know the author, you know the specifics, and you know the consequences. That's basically transparency in an earmark. And every piece of legislation is dealt with that way in the Ways and Means Committee. So if someone comes to me and says, just slip this in, my first question is, do you have a joint tax estimate? They say, no. We got to get a joint tax estimate. My whole area of schmoozing with members is to try to get joint tax to speed up an evaluation of an amendment. Not change it, not make it look good when it isn't, but to simply give them the information as quickly as possible. But then, of course, joint tax knows that I'm not going to have them bump somebody ahead of the queue. And so my job as chairman of the committee is to make sure that every member knows the consequences of their decision in a piece of legislation. What's the specific language? What does it do? What's the fiscal, financial, revenue, tax effect? We are totally transparent and have been for a long time. Contrast that, of course, with other committees that are now being required to identify earmarks and the rest. So there's not a whole lot of room to schmooze, which is why I really like the arena, because then it's a competition of ideas. The brief response I made to the question on education, just because a line item in the federal budget is reduced from giving money to go ahead and pay to schools doesn't mean you're not trying to support getting money for education in new and different ways. And the 527s and the other structures that we've dealt with in terms of 529s, excuse me, collecting money to be able to make that pot of money available, and the cooperation between states and other agencies is a whole new approach to helping fund higher education. Puts a premium on being creative, thinking outside the box, trying to solve problems in new and different ways that really respond to get people to help themselves. That's where the advantage comes in. It's a competition of ideas, which I think is where it ought to be.
Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I'm Clayton McCluskey, again from George Washington University, and originally hail from Dallas, Texas. Back in March, you told the Los Angeles Times that you weren't quite ready to read your headstone, your political headstone, that you had 9 more months left. Well, now as you head into this last stretch, I want to ask you, are you now ready to read your political headstone? And if so, what do you want to see on it?
Well, I think I've picked out the stone. But we still have a few weeks in this session, and leadership is telling us we have a lame duck. And my familiarity with lame ducks are that if you're going to do it after the election, you're probably going to do it after the election in November, probably not get it done, come back in December. There are some real opportunities for doing some things there. The other thing I'm trying to do is to find the most talented carver that I can find, because I don't think just a couple of pithy words or sentences. I mean, I want someone who can get in there and chip it pretty finely, because if someone's going to come and waste the time and energy to visit my headstone, I'm going to make them read the fine print.
Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. My name is Michael Harold, and I'm originally from Portland, Oregon. Kind of close. So you are one of the most powerful members of the House. Many in lesser positions of power within the House are jockeying for a seat in the Senate. They see the House as a stepping stone on the way to the Senate. Why have you chosen to remain as a 14-term incumbent in the House for 28 years and never run for Senate of California?
I love that question, and I'm going to add a follow-up so you'll think about it while you're answering his question, which is, and what you have famously combative relationships with the Senate, the House and the Senate. So if you can fold that whole notion of why that's been into your answer.
Actually, it's not true. Don't believe everything you read in the paper. How else do I get all this stuff done in conferences and pass major legislation if it's always a confrontation? It's very simple. Your job is to try to figure out how to get people to yes. And it isn't always what they want, but you better know what they need, because what you need to do is to accommodate through compromise so that everybody gets a piece of the action, unless it's some egregious thing for themselves only, then you kind of compromise on it. I'd say go take a look at Article 1, Section 10, describing the powers of Congress and what the House powers are and what the Senate powers are. And if you take a look at that, I found the House powers far more attractive. I guess the second reason was a realistic one. I found myself, although not born in California, in a state that at the time had 45 members of Congress, now has 53. If you're going to run statewide, you're going to need enormous amounts of money. I was able to get elected and move into a position and enjoyed doing what I was doing. Coming from a faculty, it was a whole lot like an academic senate, and you would get in and try to make things work, and you could. The Senate is a whole lot more like a feudal system in which the lords deem to meet if they choose, and that every member has a veto, which makes it very difficult. And I tend not to be able to function in that kind of a system, because one of the things is true about me, and that is if you can bring something to the table and it has merit and it's worthwhile, you get to sit at the table. But don't expect me to genuflect if you just bring you and that's all there is. And there tends to be much more of that in the Senate, frankly, than in the House. And by the time I got into a position of influence, and if I had run for the Senate, I would have needed tens of millions of dollars, 40, 50 million. I would get elected to the Senate. I would be a freshman in the Senate. And I wouldn't even be allowed to go to the conference that had I stayed in the House, I would have been chairing. For the title of senator, it's not worth it. If you come to make policy, the House is the place to be. When you go back and check Article 1, Section 10, all revenue bills originate in the House. The Ways and Means Committee controls the revenue. Trade. You go down a list of powers to initiate, and the people's house have the power, in my opinion, to significantly influence the initiation of legislation. When you look at some of the major powers of the Senate, it is to advise and consent to the president's appointments, not unlike the House of Lords versus the House of Commons. I don't want to sit and pass judgment on someone else's selection of an individual who they're going to trust in their administration. I would much rather try to shape the legislative language that directly affects the entitlement programs of Medicare, Social Security, of taxes, of trade between nations, of fundamental economic decisions, saving money for retirement, saving money for education. All of that, because of the Constitution, can only originate in the House.
We have time for one more question from a student. How about you, the young lady there on the aisle?
Hi, Mr. Chairman. My name is Karen Ramsey. I'm from the George Washington University. Before you,
Where are you from originally?
Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania, okay.
Before you came to Congress, you were a professor of political science. And I was wondering, after all your experience in Washington, up close with the government, if you were to go back now and teach political science again, is there anything you would teach differently? Have you learned anything as being a participant?
Yeah, actually the answer would be not very much. Because I didn't teach structure function. I didn't teach all of that other stuff, which I didn't think was important. Because politics, if you define it as the process of determining who gets what, when, and how, is applied to any institution. Dr. Ms. Dunn goes about the news structure, how Katie Couric got where she did. Talk about business. Talk to any of these major people in business. It's all about interpersonal relationships, power structures, and a decision matrix in terms of making things happen. And frankly, too many people focus on the what, i.e. the process of what happened, instead of the substance. So what I taught was not the what, but the why, and to a certain extent, the how. So when you're trying to get people to yes, you have to understand how they look at the world. And I found out early on that when people tell you the way the world is, they aren't telling you about the world, they're telling you about themselves. And if you agree with them, then of course you see the world the same way. But if you don't, then you've got to figure out how to get them to understand how you look at the world so that you both realize how each other looks at the world and you try to accommodate or compromise that worldview. And that is an interpersonal, ongoing, relationship-building arrangement. And that's what the House is, as is any other human institution. It just so happens it controls significant power through the sovereign structure and the ability to coerce people. So you have to be even more careful with it. And it's an aphrodisiac even stronger than a lot of other institutions, although we've seen big business and people in big business succumb to it as well. And so what I taught in poli-sci, kids would come back and tell me, was thinking 101. Conceptual frameworks, ideas. How do they go together to allow you to see the world, to see an option that someone else doesn't see? And how, when you communicate with them, why this option is better than theirs. The whole business is pushing people, getting people to accept your view of the world over theirs, and letting their vote be with you. But since it's a pure voluntary arrangement, you have to structure it enough in a way that they see a reason to be with you. The idea that somehow politics is evil or all wrong or kind of uncomfortable because it's all accommodation and compromise, it can't be anything else in a democratic system. If you make decisions quantitatively, not qualitatively, we don't have a king, you've got to make them quantitatively. Somebody's got to try to organize a structure that produces that majority. How do you do it if you have a voluntary vote? I have to give you a reason to vote with me. I can try to coerce you, I can try to bribe you, I can be chairman of the House Administration and give you a waiver that would get your vote, but I mean, that's not comforting. How about we sit down, I figure out what your needs are, we incorporate it together, we build a process where policy has a core shaped by the need to get a majority, and we make law. And that's why, going back to the original comment, you shouldn't even think about writing legislation that will endure. It will be so vague, it will be so non-responsive to current needs that one, it'll be easy to vote and it won't last very long. The process of a democracy coming to a conclusion is difficult and messy. It is a competition to get people to agree with you. But hopefully it's on the level of ideas and policy and not other baser motives in terms of making the decision. And that's based on who you put in office.
Well, that was a terrific answer, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to ask one quick follow-up question, because these students, so many of them are studying Congress. Congress has been in session fewer days this year than it has been over several decades. Do you think it actually matters how much Congress this is in session? There's a lot of talk about this, but I'd like to know whether you think being in session more would be a good thing or not. Does it matter?
Well, if you
I mean,
paid
the
me,
House, I
if you
guess, I'm
paid me
sorry.
by the hour, I think you'd find we would stay in session longer. I've never known quantity to necessarily generate quality. There's a certain minimum that you need just because the legislative process is the introduction of bills, the hearing in committees, the decision in committees, the movement to the floor, and so on. But the argument that somehow a defined work period is superior to product, I'll never understand. When I was teaching, I told my class that I'm supposed to stay here for 55 minutes, but if we can communicate and understand the core idea that I wanted to get across, and it did it in a half an hour, then I'll meet you out by the quad and we can spend 20 minutes, you know, enjoying each other. But if it takes me an hour and the bell rang and there's 5 minutes left, you will have made up enough minutes in previous classes that I just want the rest of the time to make sure you understand it. Time, process should not be the definer of work product. The quality of the work product should be the definer. And in a democracy, I'll underscore it once again, in a legislative process, it is accomplishment. It is making law. For those who criticize the process, I invite you to try it.
Thank you very much. That was excellent on your part, and thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
My pleasure.
We really appreciate your time and your participation.